Meta AI is the personal AI that's tailored to you, now with its very own app. It's built to get to know you, offering helpful answers and inspiration. Looking for something to add to your bucket list? Meta AI goes beyond traveling the world. It remembers you're a basketball fanatic and suggests you attend one of the playoff games. Just start typing or speaking to get the answers you need, wherever and whenever, because Meta AI is your personal AI. Download the Meta AI app, now available on the Apple App Store and Google Play.
Smart water. Pure, crisp taste.
That's really good water.
It's the kind of water that says, I have my life together.
I do feel more sophisticated.
Smart water. For those with a taste for taste. Grab yours today.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this season we're looking at revolutions. That includes the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and what a lot of these revolutions, what all three of those revolutions actually have in common, out of many things, is that they were inspired by ancient Rome. Ancient Rome was such a popular trending topic in the entire 18th century. And this is for various reasons, including like the ancient world just became really popular because a lot of archaeological excavations were happening. People were really excited about it. And in terms of ancient civilizations, Rome is one that people had been studying for a really long time because the records were kept quite well. And because they were written in Latin, which was a language that people continued to be able to read for hundreds of years afterwards, which is part of why Rome is people talk about it now. I wanted to air this episode this week. Firstly, Pride Month, and we've been really focusing on trans people through history, and Elagabalus belongs right up there with all of the spectacularly audacious people we've talked about on this podcast. I needed to feature Elagabalus, obviously. As a trans person also, Pride Month is a good time. And then also just because I saw on social media, somebody was saying, do you remember last year there was this whole trending thing about how many times a day did men think about the Roman Empire? And it turns out that like lots of people did. And that's because people like Joe Rogan, etc., like they also are just like the Romans, they were great. Like back to like Napoleon, back to like all these oldie-timey people, like people just kept being like the Romans, that like they had it figured out. We just need to be like the Romans. Like, y'all, the Roman Empire fell like messily and over a long period of time. And so what I saw recently, somebody was posting on social media was the fall of the Roman Empire this stupid? And they were referring, I think, there's a lot of pretty outlandish things happening in the world right now, but I'm pretty sure they were talking about America. And myself and a lot of other history enthusiasts responded to this message being like, yes, the Romans weren't these perfect, intelligent, godlike people. Like the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, like it thrived for quite a while, but like they had ups and downs and there was a lot of assholes there. And a lot of interesting and strange things happen. And one of the emperors that is not much talked about when people are like, ooh, the Romans, let's be like the Romans, is Elagabalus. And I want to situate this as well in time, because when I first recorded this episode was before Gladiator 2 had come out, but now we're in a post-Gladiator 2 world. And so for those of you who've seen that film, we can put this in a time and a place, because Elagabalus became Emperor of Rome just after Macrinus, played in Gladiator 2 by Denzel Washington, who had, in the movie and also in real life, spoiler for Gladiator 2, he had schemed to kill the previous emperors who were brothers called Geta and Caracalla. These people all come up in the episode, but just so you know, if you've seen Gladiator 2 and you know how Gladiator 2 ends, like the next thing that happens in Roman history is what we're talking about in this episode, which is this horny trans teenager, Nepo baby, gets foisted upon into the role of Emperor of Rome by their mom, who was just like a really ambitious person, and it does not go well. And I just want to say there's a lot of emperors in Roman history whose reigns were this short and were also not super successful. So when we're now thinking like, oh, the Romans, like they had it all figured out, let's be more like the Romans. When you're looking back at the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, thinking like, let's just be like Rome, like how Rome was. It's like Rome didn't work out. Like, let's look at other cultures. We know how to read hieroglyphs now. Like we know what Egypt was up to. We know what was happening in like Sumeria. Like we're learning through various different oral traditions what was happening in like the Americas. Like there was other civilizations. Like on the one hand, I'm like, can we move on from Rome? But on the other hand, I'm a messy bitch who loves the messy bitches of history. And Rome was chock full of messy bitches. And one of them was Elagabalus. And I brought on one of my favorite guests to talk about this topic. It's Dr. Kit Heyam, who has been on this podcast before, talking about first talking about their book, and then later just talking about other trans figures. And Kit has been so helpful for me when I've been researching trans history. They're so just welcoming and recommending articles and stuff to me. So I really appreciate Kit. I'm really happy to have him on the podcast again. Kit's book is called Before We Were Trans, A New History of Gender. I would call it required reading. It was the first book that I really read about trans history and just explaining gender stuff. And it was really eye-opening for me. And I still turn back to it for reference now. But Kit is also a hilarious, wonderful person. And I love having them on the podcast. And Elagabalus is one of the messiest bitches I've ever talked about on the show. So happy Pride and enjoy this episode. So I'm joined today by returning guest, Dr. Kit Heyam. Welcome back, Kit.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a total delight to be back with you.
I wanted to tell you as well that I've been secretly trying to think of a person who I could invite you back to talk about, but also a while ago I did just a casual poll on my Instagram stories asking the listeners, who would you like to have on the show again? And your name came up a lot. So
that is incredibly lovely news. Thank you, listeners. Hello. Really nice to be chatting with you. And yeah, delighted to be talking about the person we're talking about today.
So we're talking about Elagabalus, who was briefly Emperor of Rome, got a really weird reputation. I don't know, I'm saying weird reputation just because it's hard to understand what people are even saying this person was like and what they did. So why I've invited you on is because of the trans element of this narrative. And I'm using that term in kind of the broadest possible umbrella because, as we're going to discuss, what was this person's identity? The challenge is that we don't know because Elagabalus did not leave any written records of their own thoughts, right?
Exactly, yeah. And so we have this weird tension between not knowing anything at all about what was going on in Elagabalus's actual head, but as I guess we'll go on to talk about, all of the sources pointing to really interesting gender nonconformity, which has meant that for loads of trans people today, Elagabalus feels like an incredibly important ancestor. And yet we have no access to what was actually going on in their mind or with their gender or their sexuality or anything.
And that's where it's interesting as well. So first of all, like we're going to use they, them pronouns. And for me, when I was preparing these notes, I was thinking the same way as in your book, Before We Were Trans, where you kind of can you explain they, them pronouns to use that when you just don't know how to assign a person?
Yeah. So in Before We Were Trans, I use they, them pronouns for anyone unless we have really clear first person evidence of them stating a different identity. And that's basically to preserve multiple possibilities. It's like how we use they, them in a kind of passively gender neutral way to talk about anyone whose gender we don't know. And I think that really, really applies to Elagabalus, perhaps even more than most people in the past for reasons that we'll kind of get into. So they, them definitely feels like the right choice for talking about this particular figure.
Definitely. This is the first podcast I've done where the person I'm talking about, I'm applying they, them pronouns to them. And it's every source I was looking at uses he, him, basically. So if I mess up, that's because I probably copy pasted something and forgot to change the pronouns in it. So Elagabalus. I just wanted to mention first the sources that I looked at in researching this. So I listened to a couple other podcasts. There's the Emperors of Rome podcast, which is a podcast. They just go, every episode is a different emperor of Rome, and they're going person by person, which is very useful for me because it's a very casual, fun podcast. But in this one, the host had an academic guest who is explaining a bit more about this history. So the Emperors of Rome podcast. I listened to the Totalus Rankium podcast, which is another one where they go through all the emperors and then rank them. History is Gay podcast had an episode about Elagabalus where, interestingly, they used she, her pronouns. That's the only source that I found that did that. And then also an article by Alexis Mijatovac. I looked at livius.org and the Italian Art Society blog. But my main source was Harry Sidebottom's biography, The Mad Emperor, Heliogabalus and the Decadence of Rome. And I'm going to link all the sources in the notes. And Kit, if you have other sources you wanted to add, you can let me know as well, and I can add those. But do you have anything else you wanted to especially mention that you looked at?
The other source I read was another recent biography by Martin X, which is called The Crimes of Elagabalus. Quite notable, I think, that those two recent biographies, we get The Mad Emperor or we get The Crimes of Elagabalus. And I think that tells us quite a lot about the reputation we've been left with.
Well, and then also just, I'm curious, how much research have you done in your research life into ancient Rome in general? Because I have not done much. So this is a bit of a crash course for me.
Yeah, it's fully not my specialism either. I am an early modern historian by specialism. So it was really interesting, not only reading these biographies of Elagabalus, but also figuring out the ways in which ancient Rome understood gender and sexuality. And actually, there are some things in common with early modern Europe, which is quite interesting in itself. But it's been a learning experience for me as well, for sure.
Yeah, my experience of ancient Rome, I've done an episode about Agrippina, and I've done an episode about Cleopatra, and I've watched I, Claudius. So previously, all I knew about ancient Rome was really that Julio-Claudian era. And this is later on. This is quite a while later on. But I did have a sense that ancient Rome, and there's stuff in this story that it's like, oh yeah, this reminds me of I, Claudius. This reminds me of Agrippina. There's just especially among the imperial household, there's a lot of casual murder. Like there's just a lot of, that's kind of the vibe. So it's not like Elagabalus came in and was doing stuff that no one else was doing. It's like, no, this is kind of expected. If you usurp power, you're going to murder the people who didn't side with you. That's just kind of what everyone did, right? That's my understanding.
Yeah, that seems legit. And I think also, like, the weird thing about reading, when you go back to the primary sources, which I did a bit of for thinking about Elagabalus, when you go back to those, you find that those authors are also like lifting stuff from accounts of earlier mythical emperors and then just being like, and Elagabalus did this too. It's like, so it's no wonder it feels familiar if you've read earlier sources, because like some of it's just verbatim stuff from earlier sources that they've decided to apply to this figure whose story they're semi-telling, semi-inventing.
Yeah, exactly. So that's something else I wanted to talk about right off the top, which is the primary sources, if we can call it that. So the one that is actually from Elagabalus' timeline is Cassius Dio, who wrote a history of Rome. And Cassius Dio actually knew Elagabalus, worked in their imperial household and also for some previous emperors. So, but then, as I understand it, Cassius Dio, after Elagabalus' reign ended with their assassination, spoiler, Cassius Dio was really desperate to be like, I was not a part of this. I did not approve of this. Like, just to really, so that's the one thing we have from Elagabalus' lifetime is written by a person who's desperate to be like, that's not, I didn't support any of this.
Yeah, and also, very confusingly, to really adhere to the kind of damnatio memoriae, or damnation of memory that came in for Elagabalus after their death, which was like, they were effaced from all legal records and all portraits and all statues. And so at no point in Cassius Dio's account of Elagabalus' name does he actually call them Elagabalus, because he's always like alluding to them by some weird other name in order to adhere to this prohibition on talking about them. So it makes it an even more difficult source to kind of get through for that reason.
Oh, yeah. And let's talk about that as well. What was it called? The thing where they, after Elagabalus, again, reign ended badly, very brief, assassinated, spoiler. What's it called? The damnation memoriae?
Damnatio memoriae.
Mm-hmm. And what does that entail?
So that means you are legally effaced from history. So your name's effaced from documents, statues and portraits are destroyed, and it is forbidden to talk about the fact that you happened. So there's this real block on writing effective histories of Elagabalus's reign from the moment of their assassination, basically.
Well, and that's interesting because I was reading other people who were quoting from Cassius Dio. I didn't look at Cassius Dio, so I didn't realize that the name is never mentioned, but I guess that's a loophole they had to work around.
Yeah, they call mostly Dio calls Elagabalus Sardanapalus, which is like an earlier semi-mythical Assyrian king. So, and that's where a lot of the sort of resonances with older sources end up coming from.
So that was Cassius Dio, was alive at the same time. So that's the closest we have to somebody writing at the same time. Then we have writings of Herodian, who is a bit younger than Cassius Dio. So I don't think Herodian was around during Elagabalus's reign, and relied, this is the thing, Cassius Dio wrote this, and then mostly everybody else used that as their source. But what's interesting to me about Herodian's writing is that Cassius Dio was a very wealthy, privileged member of Roman society. Herodian was less wealthy and influential, so his writing provides a bit of an alternative viewpoint, that of someone who's not really in the inner circle. But again, it's drawing from Cassius Dio, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, that means that the narratives follow each other really closely. So if we're trying to figure out like what were the facts of the case, that's very difficult because of their reliance on each other.
And then the third ancient source is a thing called the Augustan History. Can you talk about the Augustan History and how it's really just kind of like erotic fan fiction, basically?
Yeah, I was going to say the Augustan History is a brilliant work of historical fiction. It's a kind of series of biographies of various emperors. It's written by one guy about 200 years after Elagabalus. It is wildly sensational. It's great fun to read. It's not primarily useful as like an actual historical source, but it has been really influential in like forming some of Elagabalus's really, really queer reputation.
And also just some of like Elagabalus is kind of a out of control tyrant with, I would say the author of the Augustan Histories is what a creative person. Some of these stories are just like, wow. Like there's one that, there's a very famous painting of this actually, and this comes from the Augustan Histories, which is Elagabalus and I forget what the painting is called. But anyway, there's this story in the Augustan Histories that Elagabalus had a dinner party and somehow suspended so many rose petals in the ceiling and then unleashed them, and then all of the guests drowned in rose petals.
What a way to go.
And here's the thing, like with Elagabalus as well. So what I did appreciate about the biography I did read, the Harry Sidebottom one, he is saying like, this is from this source. This is from this source. So and he would say, this is why we trust this one maybe a bit more than this one. And absolutely all of the wildest stories come from the Augustan History. And those are, so for me, just trying to understand this story, it's just like, okay, some of this has to be true, but some of this is clearly not true. And it seems like the most sensational stories are the ones that I'm the most dubious about, really, especially if they come from the Augustan History.
Yeah, it means that I think we're talking about someone who has a really queer history, but did they have a queer present is much, much harder. A question that's much harder to answer.
Yeah. So then we're getting into so the Syrian background of Elagabalus. So if we're looking at who their family was, I'm just going to talk about that for a minute. So Elagabalus was born probably around 204 CE in the Common Era. So their father was named Sextus Varius Marcellus, who was a Roman aristocrat and politician from Syria. And their mother was also from Syria, Julia Soemius. She's one of 3 people called Julia in this story. Kind of a triumvirate of really kind of interesting, powerful women all called Julia. So anyway, so the family was Syrian. What was this Syrian family doing in Rome in 204 Common Era? So they were the in-laws of the emperor, who was Caracalla. Is that how you say that, by the way? Do you know?
That's how I'd say it. But yeah, I'm not an ancient Roman.
That's the thing too. They're not here to ask. So Caracalla was the emperor when Elagabalus was born. Caracalla was the son of the previous emperor, whose name is Septimius Severus, which just as like a point of interest, Septimius Severus was the first African-born Roman emperor. So there is some discussion about like, was he the first Black emperor? Which like, no, but African-born. So Septimius Severus had been married to Julia Domna, who's another one of these Julias. So basically, there's so many Julias, it was all very confusing to me. But there's Syrian people, and Caracalla was the cousin of Elagabalus. Their grandmothers were sisters of each other. And so all these Syrian nobles had been in Rome for something like 25 years because they were the in-laws of the imperial family. So the Syrian background becomes extremely important when we're talking about Elagabalus and everything about them. So yeah, I'm not gonna get into the Julias themselves, these three women, but just know that they're really interesting, and I'll probably do an episode about them some other day. But they were role models for Elagabalus, like that's who they were primarily raised by, because Elagabalus's father died in 215. In 217, Caracalla was assassinated, and his prefect Macrinus took over as the new emperor. And this is where I was like, oh, this is like I Claudius. This is just, or it's kind of like a bit of history of England in the sense of like the one king is killed and then whoever killed him becomes the next king. That's kind of what's happening here. So Macrinus took over, and in the wake of this, basically this Syrian family, Elagabalus and all the Julias, were cast out of power because Caracalla's mother, Julia Domna, had been trying to scheme against Macrinus, was found out about that. And so all the Julias and Elagabalus and their family were sent kind of back to Syria. And right away, Julia Mesa, who is Elagabalus's grandmother, was just started scheming like, how can we get back in power? How can we, the Syrian family, get back in power in the Roman Empire? And you can't just, I don't know, I guess if you kill the emperor, then you can proclaim yourself emperor, but you need people to also support you at the same time. Unless, for some reason, you are the genetic son of the emperor. So Julia Mesa was like, hey, guess what? Turns out Elagabalus's father was Caracalla. Surprise. Well, and I think part of this is that Elagabalus resembled Caracalla. And Caracalla had been very popular, especially among the soldiers. So it was kind of easy to get people to support them because they liked Caracalla. Elagabalus resembled Caracalla. And so rumors started being spread by their grandmother that Elagabalus was secretly the son of the recently assassinated emperor. It makes the family tree really complicated, and I won't get into it because Caracalla was actually their cousin and all of this stuff. But numerous battles ensued. Macrinus ended up dying by suicide, and then 14-year-old Elagabalus was named Emperor of Rome. I just skipped over half of Harry Sidebottom's book because he really gets into a lot of battle history. Do you have anything to add about that?
I was going to say one of my favorite aspects of this story is the story that Elagabalus basically became emperor because they were hot. So it sounds like the soldiers kind of went to the temple where Elagabalus was working in Syria and were like, let's check out this potential heir. And then everyone was kind of awestruck by how hot Elagabalus was, and watched them dancing and was like, yeah, this person can be emperor, and like claimed they were kept coming back to this temple just to, you know, be involved in the religious rites or to for political reasons, but actually, as Herodian says, they were just coming to watch this really, really hot teenager.
Well, and that's the thing. So after the family was sent back to Emesa, which was the place in Syria they were from, so there was this temple, the temple to Elagabal, which is the name of the god. So Elagabalus, that's a name that was applied to this person later on in their lifetime. They had various Roman names. So there's this temple of Elagabal in Emesa. And so Elagabalus' family, they were descended from priest kings of this area. And then when that place was taken over by the Roman Empire, then they retained their power by just remaining the priest family, the people in charge of this temple. So Elagabalus was named the head priest in Syria, which is why they were the one doing the dancing, which is why that's who you would see doing this stuff. And which is why Elagabalus, like of all the facts that I've learned about this person, like clearly they were really devoted to this god and to this religion. And so the religion, the worship of Elagabal was, I don't know, can you explain the statue? There's this big statue that represents the god.
Yeah, so like Elagabal is a sun god. that's why, if you've heard Elagabalus referred to as like Heliogabalus, Helio meaning sun in Greek, like that's where that comes from. And yeah, is represented on Earth by a kind of big, scary, dark obelisk, which, like you were saying, it sounds like whatever you want to say about what we do or don't know about Elagabalus, one thing it seems really clear is that they were genuinely devoted to this religion, that they'd been brought up as a child priest to become head priest of this temple, and that they saw being the emperor of Rome as like a really key opportunity to kind of import this religion to Rome and win more worshippers of this sun god. And yeah, as we've been kind of alluding to, unfortunately did not work out so well.
Well, and this is, we're going to talk about this story. I don't know if I'm skipping ahead or not, but reading about Elagabalus and the devotion to Elagabal, and then being named emperor and saying like, guess what, Rome, like this is the new main god. They weren't trying to impose monotheism. They weren't saying like your other gods don't matter, but they were saying this is now the number one god. Like Jupiter is now a step down. Elagabal is the main one. And I'm like, how did you think this was going to end? It's ancient Rome. Like how, like two emperors were just recently assassinated. So all I can think is that if they were so devoted and had such a belief in this god, they felt the god wanted this and would protect them. Maybe.
And also, I think just being 14, like, I didn't make very good choices when I was 14, you know?
Which is a really crucial point as well. This is the youngest, to that point, it was the youngest ever emperor assigned. Previously, the youngest ever emperor was Nero, who had been 16 when he was named emperor. So it's unusual for Rome to have somebody this young. And I think to Elagabalus' credit, like they were clearly had a point of view and they weren't just the puppet of their grandmother as much as the grandmother had thought that was going to be what happened. Elagabalus came in with a real point of view. So exactly. So Elagabalus, this whole thing wasn't saying like, it's not like, who is that ancient Egyptian Akhenaten who came in and said, hey, guess what? Your religion is garbage. We're all going to worship the sun now. Like that wasn't, Elagabalus wasn't coming in and dismissing the previous religion. They were just coming in and saying, here's this god who is now the head god. The other gods are still there, but this is the most important one. And this is where we're going to talk a bit more about Syrian culture and anti-Syrian racism in Rome. Can you introduce that topic, Kit?
So it's basically impossible to kind of read and interpret all these primary sources that we do have of Elagabalus's reign without realizing how racist they are. You can't read them properly without kind of understanding that they are all coming from what the ancient Romans would have called an anti-Oriental perspective. And it is a really similar perspective, to be honest, to like anti-Asian racism today, to what we call Orientalism today. So this is this association of people from east of the Roman Empire, and especially actually from Syria, with effeminacy, with sexual transgression, with not being a proper man, with also like the kind of fashions and the kind of fabrics that were associated with Syrian culture were seen again as insufficiently manly in Roman culture. So when anyone says anything about Elagabalus's kind of gender transgressions or sexual transgressions, they may well be telling the truth, but if they are, that's partly because of the way they're interpreting Syrian dress. And if they're not, if they're exaggerating it, it's because that's coming from a racist place, right?
So it's something about, and I mean, to me, not knowing a lot about ancient Roman history, again, having watched I, Claudius, but they were wearing togas, like, which to me looks like a kind of gown or kind of dress. But Elagabalus, the Syrian robes were somehow to them men in togas. They thought, oh, that's too effeminate, that robe, where it's all just robes.
I know, like everyone in this story is wearing dresses, but you got to wear the manly dress.
So that's where I really want to talk about this, the religious stuff, because, well, it's all tied up with each other. But I guess even Caracalla, who had been the emperor for a couple years, was half Syrian. And so while people were saying like, oh yeah, he was beloved by the soldiers and whatever, but it's still kind of like, but he's half Syrian. So that was just kind of like, like there was this racism against him. Yeah. So part of, like you mentioned, that people, the prejudices against Syrians specifically were that they were effeminate, they were cowardly, they were prone to weird god worshipping, they were also cunning and treacherous. So it's like a lot of things that are, it's so similar to the way that people talk about other cultural groups today, really. So Elagabalus came in just kind of like in this kind of rush of people were excited because they thought this is the son of Caracalla. People kind of didn't like how Macrinus had elevated himself. I think he was like a lawyer or something, and they didn't like that. So they're just kind of like, okay, this person's great, but also they're Syrian. So like, this person's going to probably be weird. There's also some, in Elagabalus' ancestry, some Phoenician background. The Romans were also racist about the Phoenicians. Notably, the Phoenicians were thought of as especially cruel because I guess in the distant past, part of their religious ceremony had been sacrificing their own children, which is a claim that is cast about Elagabalus by some people. The Phoenicians were also thought to be sexually deviant, which in this case means oral sex performing people. So saying all of that stuff, and then when you look at the writings about Elagabalus, you're like, oh, okay, check. Like everything we just said that is a stereotype against Syrian and Phoenician people is what they're saying about Elagabalus. So that's where it's like, for me, I'm just like, how do you wade through this to be like, what can we take out of this? Because it could be somebody saw Elagabalus in these Syrian robes and thought, oh my goodness, that's a man dressed as a woman, where it's really Elagabalus. It's just like, I'm just a person wearing my Syrian outfit. So like what? Without knowing Elagabalus's thoughts, we just know how people were interpreting their behavior. And the grandmother was concerned. Like Elagabalus hadn't been raised to become the emperor because it just kind of, Caracalla was assassinated, Macrinus took over, the family was cast out, and then their grandmother started thinking, how can we figure this out? So then they looked at, okay, well, how about this? The oldest grandchild, but had been raised as this priest of Elagabal, really devoted to their cultural practices. So when the grandmother is trying to be like, what if you wear a manly toga? What if you kind of calm down about worshiping this obelisk? Like Elagabalus would not. Like the religious fervor was very genuine. So I don't know if this is true or not, but I like this. Well, I don't know, asterisks. I don't know if anything we're talking about is true, but I do like this as a detail that the grandmother was like, you need to stop dressing like this. You need to wear a manly toga. And Elagabalus was like, well, what if I just send a portrait of myself to Rome wearing this outfit? So by the time I get there, they'll know to expect this and they won't be weird about it, which, that's kind of a nice compromise, I think.
It's quite sweet, isn't it? Just like, we just need to introduce them to the fact that Syrian people dress in this way. It's like, it shows a touching kind of trust in the people of Rome, which was totally not justified.
And that's the 14-year-old aspect as well, I think. In some ways, this story reminds me a bit of Lady Jane Grey, the story in English history, who's just this young teenager who's so devoted to a religion, but incredibly sheltered and just not realizing that everyone around them is so scheming.
And just ends up like losing their life through the political machinations that someone decided to make them part of. Yeah, really similar.
Yeah, exactly. Like this was an Elagabalus did not have any ambition in life that I can tell beyond just being the best head priest possible. So it did take, this was also interesting to me, but I guess it makes sense, the distance that you have to travel and if you're traveling via chariot. So it took something like a year and a half, 2 years for Elagabalus to actually arrive in Rome. But the empire was big. So like they were the emperor, just not actually in Rome itself. And then there's a detail that also just in terms of the devotion to the god. So Elagabalus brought the obelisk with them from Syria on its own chariot. And by the time they actually arrived in Rome, there was a grand entry. And so the obelisk was in a chariot and Elagabalus was running backwards. So they could be like facing the statue as they entered the city, which is kind of a stunning image. Apparently there was people with them holding their elbows so they wouldn't trip over anything. But
that is devotion to certainly to something, maybe slightly to looking stupid. But no, yeah, like I'm joking. It's pretty impressive.
It's pretty impressive, but it's also just kind of like the grandmother, I'm sure, was just like, let's tone this down. And Elagabalus was like, or what about entering the city with the obelisk running backwards, like dressed in Syrian robes? Like, that's going to go over well. And even from the beginning, so they were emperor, not actually in Rome, but right away they were being the emperor. And it was really clear that just they were not suited to this job. This was not something that interested them, because their main passion in life was doing ceremonies to Elagabalus rather than being the emperor of Rome. Yeah, and then also in terms of the army thing, so I'd mentioned a couple of times, Caracalla had been popular until he was assassinated, or even afterwards, I guess. But because he had been a soldier, and the soldiers got him. There's a story about Caracalla. He was so busy sitting and talking with the soldiers that the politicians, like, he kept the door shut and the politicians couldn't come and talk about him. So having the support of the soldiers was really, really, really important in this setting. And although Elagabalus resembled Caracalla, they were potentially as much as like a pacifist, just not into being a soldier, not into wars at all. I mean, luckily, I guess, at this point, Rome wasn't actively engaged in war anyway, so Elagabalus wasn't called upon to like lead a legion of soldiers, but just this. So yeah, just in terms of people were first maybe excited, like, okay, this is the new emperor, it's going to be like Caracalla, and then it's like, oh no, this person looks like Caracalla, but they're not that kind of soldier guy. And then, of course, so part of the job of being emperor was to have legitimate children, was to have specifically sons who would become the next emperors. So Elagabalus had a series of marriages to women. So the first marriage was to Cornelia Paula, who was a woman from the most aristocratic family in Rome. There was a hugely expensive wedding ceremony, festivity to celebrate this marriage. Elagabalus clearly really spent a lot of money throwing parties and things like that, which was also kind of unpopular, especially because they had basically one marriage per year. And so if you think about the cost of something like, again, it's in modern times, the cost of the King Charles's coronation that just happened, like if that was happening every year, that would become kind of unpopular and expensive. So the first marriage was to Cornelia Paula. And then this is where the second marriage is where things, I don't know. I'm not going to say they get strange because they've been strange all along.
They get really bad.
This is, okay, can you explain the position of a Vestal Virgin in Roman society, just so people can understand how upsetting this was?
So if you're consecrated to the goddess Vesta, you take a 30-year vow of celibacy. If anyone violates that vow, whether it is the Vestal Virgin herself or the other person involved in that violation of celibacy, the punishment is death. This means that marrying a Vestal Virgin is not an ideal thing to do.
And that is what Elagabalus did. So they divorced Paula, which, side note, I just find it funny to have a person in ancient Rome called Paula, to marry Julia Aquilia Severa, who was one of the Vestal Virgins. And so part of the reason, I mean, this is just, everyone was shocked and appalled by this because of what you just explained, the position of a Vestal Virgin. Elagabalus was kind of coming at this from a point of view where they were also simultaneously marrying the statue, I don't know if it's the god Elagabalus or just like the obelisk, to a goddess. So it was sort of like a double marriage where like Elagabalus, the god / statue, was being married to a statue of Juno from Carthage. At the same time, Elagabalus was being married to a Vestal Virgin. And this is maybe something about then their children would be godly. So I don't know if it could have been like a ceremonial thing, just like the head priest of this is marrying the head priestess of this. But it was shocking. It was shocking to everyone. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. That's why they offer a tool called Auto Quote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. If you've ever shopped online, and let's face it, who hasn't? Chances are you've bought something from a business powered by Shopify. You know that purple Shop Pay button you see at checkout? The one that makes buying so incredibly easy? That's Shopify. And there's a reason so many businesses sell with it, because Shopify makes things easier, and not just for shoppers. They make it easy to start and run your business. Shopify is the commerce platform behind 10% of all e-commerce in the US, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started. It gives you a leg up from day dot with hundreds of beautiful ready-to-go templates to express your brand style so you can get up and running fast. You can tackle your important tasks, from inventory to payments to analytics and more, all in one place. You can also spread your brand's word with built-in marketing and email tools built for you to find and keep new customers. And remember that iconic purple Shop Pay button that's used by millions of businesses around the world? It's why Shopify has the best converting checkout on the planet. Your customers already know and love it. If you want to see less carts being abandoned, it's time for you to head over to Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/realm. Go to shopify.com/realm. Shopify.com/realm. I love a multi-use beauty product, like an eye/cheek/lipstick. It makes a full face so much easier, plus you only need to bring one product along for touch-ups. And whether you're all about simple mascara and gloss, or you love to play with bold shapes and colors, you gotta have that trusty favorite you turn to for every look. Thrive Causemetics makes certified 100% vegan and cruelty-free products you can depend on for everything from simple daily wear to show-stopping self-expression. And it's all made with clean, skin-loving ingredients, high-performance and trademarked formulas, and uncompromising standards. And Thrive Causemetics is beauty that gives back. For every product purchased, they make a donation towards 8 major causes, including social justice organizations and those impacted by cancer and homelessness. It feels good knowing that when I purchase a product, I'm also able to give back to causes that matter to me. And one product I love from Thrive Causemetics is the Brilliant Eye Brightener. Like I said, I love a product that can have multiple uses, and the Brilliant Eye Brightener is just that. It's an eyeshadow and highlighter stick that's super blendable, and I'm slowly but surely stocking up on the 31 shades that it comes in. Try your new trusty favorites with an exclusive set for our listeners. New customers can get the Liquid Lash Extensions Mascara and a mini-sized Brilliant Eye Brightener at a special set price, with free shipping available at thrivecosmetics.com/thrive. Or save more with 20% off your first order at thrivecosmetics.com/thrive. That's Thrive Cosmetics, CAUSEMETICS.com/thrive for 20% off your first order.
Imagine this. The best pasta sauce you have ever tasted sits abandoned on a plate. Wasted sauce. That is a tragedy. If only you had used Barilla al Bronzo pasta. Its bronze-cut texture holds your sauce and scoops up every last drop. The Italians call that scarpetta. Capture sauce the Italian way. Barilla al Bronzo. Click or tap the banner to find out more.
And we're back.
Yeah, and it's kind of a symbolism of uniting the two religions in exactly the way that Elagabalus really wanted to, and that the people of Rome were really kind of not up for. There's something kind of, again, lovely and somewhat 14-year-old about being like, well, I'm the head priest, and she's a really important priestess, and together we will have the most divine children, and it'll be lovely. And that's kind of adorable and really, really short-sighted.
This was of the various things that Elagabalus did that we like. This was one of the most shocking, upsetting things that they did to the people of Rome. And this is, I think, one of the things they did that we know for sure happened. Like, there's coinage showing Julia, Aquilia, Severa. Like, this marriage did happen. So yeah, everyone is shocked and horrified by this. And eventually the marriage ended in divorce in less than a year, which might have just been cultural pressure, I would imagine. Just saying like, you can't do this. You need to undo this and marry someone who's not a Vestal virgin. And so this section of my notes is just kind of stuff where I'm like, I'm going to say a thing and you'll tell me what you think what you think about it. So apparently, like knowing the devotion to this religion, Elagabalus would, and again, we don't know the rituals and rites of this religion. So all we have is just kind of like a person who hated and mistrusted them explaining what their actions were. So presumably this was part of the religious rites. So every morning, allegedly, Elagabalus would appear in public clad in the Syrian garb, the robes and jewelry. Apparently, they were the first and only Roman emperor to dress in robes of pure Chinese silk. Makeup may have been involved, and they performed sacrifices to their god with the help of priests under their rule. The Senate, like the most important men, were obliged to be present to witness this. And then there's something about the senators when when the Senate met or something like that, they had to take I don't know if it's kind of like the Pledge of Allegiance now in the United States, but they had to say a pledge to the gods and they had to put Elagabal first in this pledge. So just the religion was openly being practiced and everyone was being encouraged to practice it to the extent that if you didn't, I think you probably would be executed. Thoughts?
So all the stuff about gender is obviously, like, as a trans historian, the most fascinating aspect of this for me. There's a lot in Dio's text, not just about the clothes, but also about like jewelry and makeup and removing body hair. And at one point, supposedly someone comes in and calls Elagabalus Lord, and Elagabalus says, "Call me not Lord, for I am a lady." So, like, really, clear articulations of gender. And like we've said, there's this sort of feedback loop between the racism and the gender nonconformity. So, like, it's not clear whether it was like Elagabalus is Syrian, so we are going to say that they were gender nonconforming, or whether it's like we've seen that Elagabalus is gender nonconforming, so we're going to be racist about them and then also draw on all of the stereotypes of Syrianness to like embellish those stories. I mean, I think given that in Roman culture, what we know about ideas of masculinity were that you weren't just inherently masculine if you had like a particular type of body. You kind of had to earn masculinity through your actions. And it seems really clear Elagabalus was not earning masculinity through any of their actions, or they wouldn't have got that reputation. So that much I think we can know, that they were not doing Roman manhood correctly, that this was someone who was seen by their society in a way that was not masculine, despite having a certain type of body, which we would now associate with maleness. And so in a way, I think that's where Elagabalus' trans history comes from. We don't know what was going on in their heads, but their story tells us that masculinity could be disassociated from this particular type of body. And also that there were lots and lots of ways in which someone could be understood as gender nonconforming in that period. And that, I think, is why they have so much resonance for trans people today, which is important and an aspect of their history that, I really want to acknowledge and not just sweep over under the carpet, I guess.
Yeah, and this reminds me as well. So in your book, Before We Were Trans, everybody should read it. You describe how I'll just call it like the umbrella of trans history. It's not just, here's a person who was assigned a certain gender at birth, and from an early age, they knew that they were a different kind of person, and then began expressing that in adulthood. There's a whole umbrella of gender nonconforming behavior. So in terms of Elagabalus, the sources that I was looking at, they're either saying like this was a man who was behaving in this way. That one podcast was saying like they saw this as a trans woman in that sort of conventional narrative of gender and sex not aligning initially. But can you explain about trans history? There's so much gray area. There's so many different ways. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the way I like to look at it is that we're not really talking about trans people in the past, unless that's how they describe themselves, because it's really important to me to understand people on their own terms. So I wouldn't call Elagabalus a trans woman because we don't know that that's how they would have described themselves. But I would say that we can describe their story as trans history, because that's any history that helps us to understand that gender has never been uncontested or fixed or tied to particular types of body. And Elagabalus' story shows us that really, really clearly, shows us that there is nothing new about thinking about gender as something we can disrupt and challenge and kind of untie from particular types of body. And regardless of what was going on in Elagabalus' head, we know that their contemporaries, including Dio, saw them in a way that was not masculine, and in fact presented them as someone who wanted to be a woman. The thing we haven't mentioned is also the story about Elagabalus wanting what we would now call gender reassignment surgery. And I do find that really interesting, because, like I said, a lot of the kind of aspects of Dio's narrative about Elagabalus, them are, you can read them as anti-Syrian racism. You can also read them as just repeating these stories about this earlier mythical king, Sardanapalus. But the surgery thing is new and doesn't get applied to anyone else. And that is something that really makes me think maybe there is something other than just prejudice and racism going on in these narratives of gender nonconformity, because otherwise, where did that come from?
Yeah, and that was the part of the story where I was exactly what you just said, where there's parts of this story that also, to me, they're similar to narratives of Caligula or Nero or other sort of like quote unquote scandalous, non-conforming Roman emperors. But the thing about that Elagabalus tried to get the physicians to find a way to give them gender reassignment surgery. Like, that's such a specific detail. And also, I don't know what that is, a specific detail that doesn't reoccur anywhere else. But then also there's something about in this, could that have been something misinterpreted by Dio about the ritual castration that might have been involved in this religion? I don't know. Because that's another thing. Like, some of the religions, some of the Eastern religions of this time did have eunuchs were part of it. So I don't know.
What's interesting about what Dio says is explicitly specifies this was because Elagabalus wanted to be a woman, and it was definitely not for religious reasons. And of course, that could be a way of just kind of delegitimizing that desire and saying it's not noble in any way. But Dio does go to some lengths to specify that this isn't about religion. This is about what's going on in Elagabalus' mind.
Mm-hmm. No, and that's the detail that really jumps out at me about this story is and again, like, we're having Dio saying this is what Elagabalus said. But like you just said, and I really want to emphasize, it's not, so many of the other stories are kind of reused stories about other people, but nowhere else, I don't think, anyone else is said to have this desire. So that's really interesting. Yeah. And I do want to also just mention, like, I don't want it, this isn't like genital talk, but like the fact that Elagabalus was married several times to several different women and never conceived a child is also interesting and could speak to physiology in some way, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's true. Or to the kind of sex that Elagabalus wanted to have, because, we also haven't talked about potentially all the men they thought were really hot.
We're just getting into that part because Elagabalus loved sporting events, especially chariot racing. So they would drive in races themselves. And during one of these races, this very hot guy called Heracles tumbled out of his chariot, apparently in front of Elagabalus, took off the helmet, and just in sort of like an anime sort of thing, took off the helmet, shook out this long, curly, blonde hair. And Elagabalus was apparently immediately smitten, to the point that allegedly they took Heracles as their husband, and Heracles was elevated to a very influential part in court. So this is similar to, you hear about royal favorites, like James I/6 of England and Scotland had male favorites and stuff. So this is where I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about, because there's the gender stuff, there's the trans stuff, but then there's also this kind of queer stuff where it's like, was Elagabalus having relationships with men? And how do you what's the relationship of those two aspects, and how do you untie that from each other?
Yeah, I guess in Roman culture, you sort of don't untie them from each other, because one of the aspects of doing manhood properly for Romans is not being penetrated, right? So penetration by a man means that you are gendered somewhat more femininely. So it's all sort of part and parcel of the same thing. It's part of the anti-Syrian racism. It's part of the gender nonconformity stuff. It's part of the making poor political decisions, or, using how hot your chariot racer is as a basis for promotion. It's part of that stuff too. And it's really, really reminiscent of researching people, like you said, like James VI and First, or like Edward II in England, who I've done work on before. It's really reminiscent of all of those stories of, like, maybe if Elagabalus had just, quietly slept with these guys and not given them important jobs, maybe it would all have been fine. But much like all of those people who came afterwards, Elagabalus did not make those decisions, and so it really, really wasn't fine.
Yeah, well, and this is, again, we're saying like they were 14 when they became emperor. At this point, they're, I don't know, 15, maybe still extremely young. But to just be like, oh my gosh, I'm in love. Like, it's a bit relatable in that way, where you're just like, this is the coolest guy I've ever met. He's so hot. Like, just kind of really getting swept away with this romance, perhaps.
And again, like, let 14-year-olds do that, right?
Yeah. No, exactly. And there's, I guess, the thing about like maybe marrying Heracles, and then this is interesting because Elagabalus allegedly wanted to name them Caesar, to make them sort of their heir, to make them kind of co-ruler. And that was shut down. So it's showing at this point Elagabalus did not have absolute power over everything. Like, their grandmother and the senators around, like, would not let that happen. So there was some limits to what they were able to get away with. Okay, this part I don't know if it's from the Augustan history or where it's from, but this is a wild detail, is that apparently Elagabalus was really interested in men with large penises, to the point that they assigned agents to go out to the bathhouses to find men with large penises and bring them back to them. Thoughts on that?
I mean, sounds like a really, really 15-year-old decision. Yeah, there's it seems like a really good example of, if you want to make it clear that someone is not basing their political decisions on, like, logic and scholarship, what's the worst thing they could be basing their political decisions on? I know, penises. So it seems to me to be something that comes from that place, while also, again, like, not being a detail that crops up in other people's reigns, so potentially based on something that was actually observed as well.
Yeah, and so out of this hunt for large penises, they find this man called Aurelius Zodicus, who is an athlete from Smyrna. This was the person who met Elagabalus and said, "My lord," or something, which is where Elagabalus allegedly said, "Call me not lord, for I am a lady." And then I don't even know, allegedly there's something about Elagabalus liked to be caught by Heracles with other men so that Heracles would beat them, proudly showing off the black eyes as signs of love. Like, I don't even know. That's could be true, to each their own, but like,
yeah, maybe just kink.
yeah. But then it's like, well, how would Cassius Dio know that? But then it's like, I guess everyone knows what the emperor is up to, and Elagabalus was not a private person, so everything they were doing was people would know. And I guess the emperor was never really left alone, so there's always going to be servants who see things. Cassius Dio does write about Elagabalus had sex with women, a lot of women, all the time, apparently, conducted themselves in the most licentious fashion, is how Cassius Dio described it, but then went on to say that this was practice, so Elagabalus could figure out how to better have sex with men by practicing with women. So there's just a lot of, this is where I don't know. Okay, so if I'm looking at a story about someone like Cleopatra, for instance, or even Mary, Queen of Scots, women who we know of who had 2 monogamous relationships in a row, and yet male historians are like, she was a slut, she was having sex with everybody, she was a nymphomaniac, where it's like, it's easy to be like, no, that's just somebody slandering them. Like, that's obviously someone just slandering them. But with this, I'm just like, were they having all this sex with all these people? Like, I don't know. Like, is that slander? Like, to have sex with women wouldn't be? But I don't know. There's a lot of sex details in Cassius Dio's writings about Elagabalus.
Yeah, very much. And I don't want to be like, clearly this is slander. Clearly this 15-year-old who suddenly had access to loads of power and hot people was not taking advantage of it. In a way that would be extremely understandable and sensible. And again, it feels like what Cassius Dio was really angry about is that Elagabalus is doing this stuff sort of instead of being a good emperor. I think if they'd made some like sensible emperor decisions and then gone off and had loads of sex, that probably would have been okay.
Yeah, you're right. So it's that element of it. So it's not just, it's the fact that they were worshiping Elagabal and or having sex with people apparently 24 hours a day to the exclusion of being emperor. So then Cassius Dio writes that Elagabalus left the palace wearing a wig and went to taverns and brothels, driving out the sex workers and taking their place, and also equipped a room in the palace as a brothel. He writes that Elagabalus wore makeup, a hairnet, and worked with wool as a woman would. Like, this is, again, just sort of the effeminacy. But the sex work stuff, like, there's something about some religions at this time had ritual prostitution. So there's the option that maybe that's what Elagabalus was doing. But like, to go out and work as a sex worker is not, again, it's not something that comes up in Caligula. It's not something that comes up in Nero. Like, it said that they both went to the brothels, but to actually go there and be a sex worker is a different accusation.
Yeah, and it's kind of the ultimate in, quote unquote licentiousness, I guess, isn't it? That someone would choose to make having sex and probably being penetrated. That's what's being implied here, right? It's like your clients are men, and that is it feels like there's an element of Dio going, what is the worst thing I could say about this person? But then also, where did that come from? Given that, as you say, it's not something that's been drawn from other from accounts of other emperors' reigns in the same way as some of the other details are. It is something that's pretty unique, and so again, really hard to tell whether it's what we might think of as slander or whether it's an accurate depiction. Maybe not of Elagabalus doing this for money, but of Elagabalus really devoting a lot of time and kind of an investment to sex in a way that they weren't supposed to do.
And it's interesting it's in the Harry Sidebottom book, towards the end, he's talking about, Cassius Dio was obviously appalled by all of this and wrote this whole book, or not this whole book, but wrote this part of the book, just being like, look at this stuff that this horrible person did. But the average everyday people, like, did they care? Did they support it? And Harry Sidebottom suggests that maybe some people did. Maybe some people thought it was kind of cool to be the emperor and just to be like really sexually liberated or whatever you would call it back then. So the sex acts themselves were not necessarily what was shocking. It was the fact that they were not also being the emperor, I guess.
Yeah, I reckon that's exactly what's going on, that we would have a really different narrative if we'd had a really effective emperor who also happened to have a lot of sex.
So, Elagabalus, last time we talked about their marital status, they had married the Vestal Virgin. That marriage was ended. So then they married somebody whose name was Annia Aurelia Faustina, who was another aristocrat. She was already married to a man. So that man was executed, and then Elagabalus married her. And to me, that seems kind of par for the course for ancient Rome marriage things. That to me is like the most normal part of this story. But this marriage was also brief because Elagabalus divorced her and remarried Julia Aquilia Severa, the Vestal Virgin, again. So it's something like the reign was like 3 years long or something, and contained at least 4 marriages, potentially more. But I will also notice in terms of like doing emperor stuff, so archaeologists have established Elagabalus was responsible for the creation, like building structures being made. So a circus to the east of the city, and they were responsible for the finishing touches to the baths of Caracalla in Rome. And in the gardens of the bathhouse, they built shops, an athletic track, sports fields, gardens, massage rooms, saunas, 2 reading rooms, a hair salon, perfumeries, cafeterias, music pavilions, and a museum, which sounds like a really great place to go spend the day. So there was that sort of building of buildings was an important part about being Roman emperor, and they did manage to do a bit of that. But again, like we mentioned to this several times, but this reign is very short-lived. It was clear very early on, especially to his grandmother, Julia Maesa, that this is not the way to restore their Syrian family to a great influential position in Roman society, because Elagabalus was not doing a very good job at being the emperor. So she tried to think of what's a way that she could keep power. Her family could keep their influence, but get rid of Elagabalus. So I wanted to mention, too, just the role of women in Roman society at this time. So women could not hold civic or military office. Like, she could not rule as empress in her own name, like, even though she was clearly probably fundamentally suited to that job, just based on her scheminess, her ambitions. So her plan was to get her other grandson, Alexander, who is just a couple years younger than Elagabalus, named as Elagabalus' heir and kind of co-emperor. And Alexander, because he was younger and because the family had already been cast out when he was young, he had been kind of groomed in this way, like raised to know how to be a good emperor in a way that Elagabalus was not. So eventually, like, Julia's plan was to have Alexander named co-heir and then to get Elagabalus assassinated, probably. So Alexander could take over. Elagabalus didn't know that that was the secret plan, and so agreed to adopt their 12-year-old cousin. And this adoption was done in the Senate. And this is, I tried to find some more details about this because it interested me, the role of women in the Senate during this era. So these three women, all called Julia, were all really powerful and really smart and very influential over Elagabalus. So he arrived at the Senate with his young cousin, as well as Julia Maesa, their mother, Julia Suemus, who sat on either side of them. So women were not supposed to be allowed in the Senate. This was not done. Like, I did a whole episode with Agrippina where she hid behind some sort of curtain just to listen in so she could have influence. So women were brought in. And in fact, during this brief reign, women, basically women in their family, whose name was Julia, were able to attend the Senate for the first time in Roman history. Elagabalus perhaps created a Senate for women. And I think one of the Julias, maybe the mom, was named actually a senator. Anyway, after Elagabalus' death, this women's Senate was one of the first measures to be revoked, and the male senators vowed that no woman would ever enter the Senate's house again. So I just thought that was interesting in terms of, under the umbrella of gender nonconformity, like Elagabalus viewing women as equal to men in this way that was very unconventional and unusual.
Which would potentially make sense if Elagabalus saw themselves as a woman, or as, neither a man nor a woman, that they would have a more flexible perspective on gender, right?
No, exactly. And that's another thing that I find stands out to me in this story, that they were clearly not thinking in this binary way. Women are like this, men are like this. Anyway, so they adopted Alexander. This is a point. So they divorced the Vestal Virgin again. Or maybe this is the first time. The timeline is a bit. Anyway, it's a very short reign. There's a lot of marriages and divorces all happening. But so they kind of were playing nice. They agreed to adopt Alexander, divorce the Vestal Virgin. But as time went by and Alexander rapidly became more popular across Roman society, Elagabalus was like, wait. This, I see what happened here. And so plotted to have Alexander killed, but he was outsmarted by the Julias, who were mostly, except for his mother, or their mother, supporting Alexander. To the point that their grandmother, Julia Maesa, began claiming that it actually turns out, wouldn't you know, Alexander was also secretly the son of Caracalla. What a coincidence. So therefore, Alexander could rule as emperor himself without having to be connected to Elagabalus. Elagabalus began to spread rumors that Alexander was dying, and when they made public appearances, they wouldn't bring Alexander with them. But the public really liked Alexander, and they worried about Alexander, so there was a joint appearance made, Elagabalus and Alexander. And I don't know if this happened sequentially right that day, but effectively what happened is the crowd was really happy to see Alexander. Elagabalus got upset and ordered that the crowd be punished, but instead the soldiers rioted against the emperor and everyone who supported the emperor. Elagabalus' courtiers were killed. Elagabalus was assassinated, as was their mother, and then their bodies were dragged through the city and then thrown into the sewers. And that was the brief reign of Elagabalus, I guess.
And it's really kind of sad, because this is just, if you look at it one way, this is a story of a teenager who was having a totally fine life devoted to a religion that they've been raised in, who was then plucked from that, made emperor, tried to make it work, made some decisions that like many 14-year-olds would make that weren't really in their best interests, but that were in the interests of the religion they were devoted to, and probably also in the interests of being excited about suddenly having access to sex as a teenager, had their family turn against them because they were no longer useful, and was murdered at the age of 18. That's pretty tragic, all told, I think.
Yeah, and then you look at those biographies, like the Mad Emperor, the crimes of Elagabalus. Like the reputation is so much focused on like that it was just this, that they were this power mad, tyrannical, sex obsessed weirdo. Where it's like,
what 16-year-old is not a power mad, tyrannical, sex obsessed weirdo? Like, that's Put anyone in that position at the age of 16, 14 to 18 is the years where they were actually in power, and see what they do, and only then judge Elagabalus, I think.
I think so too. So they were, after you described already, after their death, so statues were taken down. Some of them were chiseled off and redone to have Alexander's face instead of Elagabalus's face. Name was chiseled off of inscriptions. The coins were melted down. They made new coins with Alexander on them instead. And immediately, as part of this, so stories were spreading about what a horrible emperor they had been, what a tyrant they were. So, and this is partially, and I don't know, and we don't know, but partially just as part of this, what was it called? The term, the
Damnatio Memoriae.
So as part of that, just sort of stories about them being terrible were shared. But also it's like, well, maybe some people had been secretly thinking they were terrible and now they felt safe to share those stories. But how much of that is just racism, etc. And then it was 200 years later, the Augustan History came out, which really came out with all these stories like drowning in rose petals. And there's stuff about like, I don't know, just weird things like that Elagabalus would lock an elephant and a tiger in a chapel and then would like throw testicles in there. It's just like weird stuff, like a great work of fiction, but just really just making Elagabalus this complete, unrelatable, absolute monster.
Yeah, just how much scandalous stuff can we make up and get away with? And yeah, that kind of develops later on into a really interestingly queer reputation. Like by the 19th, 20th century, queer people, mostly men, mostly gay, like gay or queer men, are kind of relating to Elagabalus. And then as we get into 20th, 21st century, trans people are going, this person asked people to make them a vagina in the Roman Empire. That's pretty trans. And so we have Elagabalus going from being like totally ostracized, going from this Damnatio Memoriae, which, by the way, shout out to brilliant author Ada Palmer for teaching me how to say that and what that is. It's not something I just know because of ancient Rome. It's something I know because of sci-fi. We go from that to actually queer communities really finding Elagabalus a kind of important ancestor. And that, in a way, for me, is like the happiest thing that comes out of this. Like, it's a tragic story, but then the fact that so many people have found community in it later on is the kind of redemptive in some way.
Well, and it's interesting too to see how that reputation developed. You mentioned, so in the 19th century, people, it's like the decadent movement. So people like Oscar Wilde and that sort of people, like they found, I think, the Augustan History, and they were just like, oh, this person is just like us, just sort of like a person who's into just sort of living sensually, like a hedonist. And so they related to that aspect of Elagabalus. And now, like you mentioned, I think the stuff about Elagabalus wanting gender reassignment surgery becomes sort of, I don't know. So, and this is part of what your work was, especially in your first book, was it's not looking at queer people from history as like, they're all heroes, but it's just kind of like, well, they were there. And that's just interesting, and that's important to know and to acknowledge. Like Elagabalus was a terrible emperor, but a tragic figure, just this kind of teenager who didn't really know what they were doing. And so I'm not here to be like, Elagabalus, like, yeah, greatest emperor in history, but an interesting and notable person. And I'm glad that their story is being shared and found and appreciated.
Yeah, 100%. And that for queer people now who are thinking, was there anyone like me in the past, that we have these stories and these reputations which don't necessarily tell us that much about what was going on in Elagabalus's head, but do tell us about how they were seen, and therefore do tell us that gender and sexuality have always been so much more flexible than we think. And that's important in itself.
I think so too, yeah. So even like Elagabalus's story is interesting and noteworthy, but also just the way that gender and sexuality have been understood throughout all of history, I think is a really important thing for people to understand and to see. It's not just like gender was invented in America in the 1950s. And it's like, no, like everything's always been sort of fluid and flexible and interesting. And there's been gray areas like throughout all of history. Like this is such an incredibly long time ago, the 2,000 years ago that this was happening. And even then, like Elagabalus proudly wore these robes that people in Rome thought were more effeminate and whatever, I don't know. I think it's really, really, really important to look at throughout all of history. It's not just been a binary experience.
Yeah, 100%. And if people take anything from Elagabalus's story, I think they should take that.
Thank you so much for talking about this with me. It was such a challenging thing for me to research because there's so little known and the sources are so incredibly biased.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a really great opportunity to look at some weird Roman texts and to think about how we do tell the story of someone whose inner thoughts we can't access, and how we talk about them as trans history while respecting the whole multiplicity of what was going on for them and for the people who was writing their story. I've loved it. Thank you so much.
Can you tell everybody just about your book, which I think has just come out in paperback as well, if they want to learn more about your work? Like, I think that book is a great introduction to what you're doing, what you're about.
Sure, thank you. So yeah, my book, Before We Were Trans, A New History of Gender, is a global history of gender nonconformity of all the people who don't really fit into kind of modern and or Western trans categories, but who still show us that gender has always been open to disruption and challenge and play. And yeah, it just came out in paperback in the UK. It's also out in North America, and I think the paperback over there will be out next year. So do check it out if you'd like to.
And you have a website as well. I'm just thinking, after people hear this episode, they're going to want to know more about you and see what you're up to. So can you just share like your website and social media and things so people can see what you're thinking about lately?
Sure. So you can find my website at kitheyam.com, find out about all the heritage and other stuff that I'm working on at the moment. And my Twitter is at krheyam.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much for joining me again for this wild ride. Honestly, just what a story.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I'm joined by Kit Heyam for a return appearance to wrap up the Elagabalus episode, because I only realized, I think it was only after I posted the episode, someone said, why didn't you score Elagabalus? And I was like, I completely forgot that that's what I do. So Kit, thank you so much for taking the time to go through this again. Elagabalus, I mean, the first category is scandaliciousness, which I mean
they were literally murdered for their scandaliciousness. I can't really, off the top of my head, think of many people who you've covered on your podcast who would need to score higher than Elagabalus.
I mean, just the highlights of it. Like, I'm going to edit this onto the end of the episode itself, but running backwards into the city, trying to change the religion of Rome to worship this obelisk, like volunteering at night to go work in brothels for fun. Just
call me not man, for I am a lady. All of the kind of brilliant teenage unconsciousness of how badly they were doing emperor and how badly they were doing Roman masculinity. And as a result, as you say, emperor for 5 minutes, murdered pretty quickly, literally their entire story erased from Roman history by law. They've got to be a 10 in scandaliciousness, right?
If there was a higher than 10, they would get that, because even in the context of ancient Rome, which was a very scandalous society, people were murdering each other like all the time. The fact that Elagabalus was like one step too far for them, is, yeah.
That's a lot.
I think it's a lot. So sort of like the conversation we just had about public universal friend, though, I don't know about scheminess for Elagabalus. I feel like they weren't coming in being like, here's my 5-point plan to change Roman religion. I think they were just like, hey, let's just do this. Let's just have a good time.
I
don't think there was much scheming.
If they'd done any effective scheming, they might not have crashed and burned so spectacularly. Let's give them some credit. They were a teenager. They'd just been like a really hot young priest and then were co-opted to be Roman emperor. They didn't really have a chance at the whole scheming thing. I think they get a pretty low score on this.
I mean, the only scheminess points I would give them is if genetically they had inherited any from their incredibly scheming mother. If there's like a dormant scheminess DNA strand that just never got to be activated, if some of the mom scheming wore off on them, I'm going to say 1. I'm going to give them a 1 for scheminess because they did for DNA reasons. Significance of Elagabalus. And I'm very curious to know how you see their significance to, for instance, trans history.
Yeah, they've got a really queer afterlife. They were seen as a kind of important gay male figure for quite a while. For a lot of people in the 19th century, they were really significant to like gay men's history. And then they've been taken up as a kind of a trans ancestor by lots of trans people subsequently, and are now really important to lots of people because of that. So yeah, I'd go pretty high in that respect. As we talked about in the kind of main episode, like most of what we know about them is reputation rather than, it's the mark they left on the society after their death rather than necessarily anything from their perspective. But because of that reputation, they've become really significant to queer history, I think. More so than they are to Roman history, arguably, given that they didn't really get to do very much as emperor.
No, they're very much a footnote in a longer saga of Roman history. Yeah, their significance as Roman emperor was like, just everyone was kind of freaked out for 2 weeks and then they killed them. But I do feel like there's significance. And this is where like I like to have my scoring scale where people who are significant to this show, or like how we talk about people on the show and their significance in a not to the mainstream academic way that these figures have been looked at throughout history. Like I think that the significance to queer history and trans history is huge for Elagabalus, this messy weirdo. I wanna say a 10 for significance as well. Just in terms of like as a trans ancestor, but also the importance to queer men. But also there's like the famous painting, that one with the falling rose petals and stuff.
Yeah, huge like cultural afterlife.
Exactly. There were so many Roman emperors who did not have this renaissance of interest in the 19th century. So, and then again, the complex sexism bonus.
Yeah, I kind of think sexism held Elagabalus back quite a lot in that one of the major problems that people had with them was their inability to conform to Roman styles of masculinity or standards of masculinity, which, as we talked about in the main episode, is partly a racism thing and partly about the association of Syrian people with effeminacy. And, much as you were talking about earlier, definitely sexism was not the only problem. There was racism going on. There was opposition to their religious beliefs going on. But if there hadn't been so much misogyny in their life, I think they'd have had a better time.
Yeah, I do think, and I love that interpretation of sexism, because often when I'm looking at the story of like a cis woman, it's just kind of like, well, women in society couldn't do this and this and this. But sexism is not just anti-women, it's anti-femininity, it's anti-effeminacy, which is what, like Elagabalus had, overlapping things that people were freaked out about. But the gender presentation, I think, was a huge one. So how much that, I could see Elagabalus being a different sort of teenager who maybe did conform to the masculinity, might still have been assassinated.
Yes. I think
for religious reasons.
Yeah, the whole shrine has changed the religion of Rome thing is never going to do well, even if you're incredibly masculine. But I'd go maybe like a 7 or 8.
Yeah, let's go with an 8. So this gets them up to a 29. So let me just see who that makes them neighbors with, who you might be familiar with. Hatshepsut is 29.
A more successful ruler, but also someone whose memory was erased after their death, interestingly.
Yeah, and who also had some, the way that gender was presented was part of why their memory was erased afterwards. Oh, and you know who else has a 29? Louisa May Alcott.
Oh, hey. All of the trans ancestors.
Yeah, 29 is a popular score for people outside the gender binary. But thank you so much for joining me to add that on. So I'm going to post this so people can see where Elagabalus fits in on this scale. And thank you again, Kit, for joining me for another excellent conversation.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a total joy, as always.
So I do want to mention the most important things. Firstly, is that I and Foster, the host of this podcast, I'm going to be in Toronto in July. We're going to be having a meetup in Toronto on Sunday, July 20th. And if you want to know the time of day and where we're meeting, you can RSVP at vulgarhistory.com/meetup. That's vulgarhistory.com/meetup. If that link for some reason is not working, you can just email me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com and just let me know you want to come. There's a lot of people coming, and I think we're going to have a real fun time. The second extremely important thing is that I have written a book that is called Rebel of the Regency, The Scandalous Saga of Caroline of Brunswick, Britain's Uncrowned Queen. And if we're talking about messy bitches of history, her husband, everybody in this book, I wrote the book, so I'm not objective, but I'm just going to tell you it's a really fun book. It's like this podcast. It's talking about history, but also making it fun. Caroline of Brunswick she lived in the Regency era, which is like, if you know Bridgerton, like that era. And she was just like tits out party girl, having a nice time. People tried to hold her back and she would not be held back. And it's just like, it's such a good saga. A lot of people didn't know about her. A lot of people are going to know about her after my book comes out. And anyway, if you pre-order this book, which comes out in February 2026, if you pre-order it now through any online retailer in Canada or the US or from your local bookstore, make sure that you take a picture or a screen capture of your receipt, and then you can submit that to me, and then I'll send you some treats, which include a year-long paid membership to my Patreon, a year-long paid membership to my Substack, and also Caroline of Brunswick paper dolls designed by Siobhan Gallagher, which have to be seen to be believed. They're so cute. Also, in terms of my book, Rebel of the Regency, so go to rebeloftheregency.com to let me know that you have pre-ordered it, to upload your picture of your receipt. And then also, please, please, please add it on Goodreads and on Storygraph if you're somebody who records the books that you want to read on there, because it's really important for the success of this book that my publisher and everybody can see how much enthusiasm there is about it. So again, it's called Rebel of the Regency by Anne Foster, and pre-order it or just add it on your Goodreads or on your Storygraph. And I guess I'll just mention, because we're talking about the Roman era as well, that we do have a brand partner, Common Era Jewelry, which is an American company. It's a small business owned by a woman who literally just had a baby, but she's still working because that's what you do in America. Her name is Tori, and she's great. She designs all the jewelry herself, and then she has a small team that manufactures it, also all in America. And it is jewelry inspired by the classical history, by the classical world. There's some imagery inspired by pieces of actual jewelry from ancient Roman days, from ancient Egyptian days. And there's also pieces that have the images of some women from this time period. So if we're talking about ancient Rome, you've got Livia, you've got Agrippina, you've got Cleopatra, who is not Roman, but she was involved in that era. Elagabalus not on a piece of jewelry, but maybe one day. Who knows? And so I just want to let you know that they are a company that I support. I have several of their pieces. And if you wanted to buy something from them, including something from their recent Zodiac collection, you can use a little discount. Vulgar History listeners can get 15% off your order from Common Era by going to commonera.com/vulgar or using code VULGAR at checkout. That's commonera.com/vulgar or using code VULGAR at checkout. And anyway, we're midway through Pride Month, and I've got one more special Pride bonus episode coming out next Friday, a regular episode coming out on Wednesday, and thank you all for listening. My name is Ann Foster, and until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is researched, scripted, and hosted by Ann Foster. That's me. Editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. Transcripts of this podcast are available at vulgarhistory.com by Aveline Malik. You can get early, ad-free episodes of Vulgar History by becoming a paid member of our Patreon for as low as $1 a month at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. Vulgar History merchandise is available at vulgarhistory.com/store for Americans, and for everyone else at vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. Follow us on social media at Vulgar History Pod, and get in touch with me via email at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com.
You might think you know fairy tales, and you might think that they are cute and sweet and boring. But the real Grimm fairy tales were not cute at all. They were very dark, and they were often very grim. On Grim, Grimmer, Grimmest, we tell a Grimm fairy tale to a bunch of kids. Perfect for car rides or screen-free entertainment, Grim, Grimmer, Grimmest activates kids' imaginations and instigates fun conversation. Because fairy tales speak to all of us at a very deep, primal level, and they raise interesting topics and questions that are worth chewing over together as a family. Every episode is rated Grim, Grimmer, or Grimmest, so you, your kids, your whole family can choose what is the right level of grim for you. Though, if you're listening with Grandma, she's just gonna go for Grimmest. Trust me on this one. Tune in to Grim, Grimmer, Grimmest, and our new season, available now.
Can you actually change your personality if you want to? How does peer pressure work, and why is it so powerful? Should you ever really trust your gut when you make a big decision? These are just a few of the topics we've recently covered on my podcast, Something You Should Know. I'm the host, Mike Carruthers, and each episode of Something You Should Know covers multiple topics that are likely relevant to you. You'll discover things you can use in your life today, right now, like how to have a great conversation, how to be more courageous, the anatomy of the perfect apology, and much, much more. To date, there are over 1,000 episodes of Something You Should Know, and we've gotten over 4,000 mostly 5-star reviews. I invite you to check out Something You Should Know. Look for the bright yellow light bulb on the blue background. Something You Should Know, wherever you listen to podcasts.
American history is full of infamous tales that continue to captivate audiences decades or even hundreds of years after they happened. On the Infamous America podcast, you'll hear the true stories of the Salem witch trials and the escape attempts from Alcatraz, of bank robbers like John Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd, of killers like Lizzie Borden and Charles Starkweather, of mysteries like the Black Dahlia and D.B. Cooper, and of events that inspired movies like Goodfellas, Killers of the Flower Moon, Zodiac, 8 Men Out, and many more. I'm Chris Wimmer. Join me as we crisscross the country from the Miami drug wars and Dixie Mafia in the South, to mobsters in Chicago and New York, to arsonists, kidnappers, and killers in California, to unsolved mysteries in the heartland and in remote corners of Alaska. Every episode features narrative writing and cinematic music, and there are hundreds of episodes available to binge. Find Infamous America wherever you get your podcasts.